Welcome in, everybody, to our deep dive today. We're going to be taking a look at pre-modern maps of India and how they showed the sacred landscape.
Yeah, it's really fascinating
It
because
is.
how these maps really show us a worldview where the sacred and geography were super intertwined.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What are some of the things that stand out when we look at these maps?
Well, one of the most striking things is that temples are always at the center of everything.
Uh-huh.
Often you find them literally at the center of the map, and the surrounding landscape is kind of radiating outwards from there.
That makes sense. I mean, temples were hugely important religious and social centers
Yeah.
back then. But was this just about practicality or was there something more to it?
Oh, it was definitely more than practicality.
Okay.
By placing temples at the center, map makers were making a statement about how they saw the world.
Yeah.
They were saying that the divine was at the core of their understanding of everything. It's like the map itself becomes this symbolic representation of the cosmos with the temple, the axis mundi connecting heaven and earth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's not just showing where things are, it's about expressing a whole belief system.
Yeah,
Do
exactly.
you have any specific examples?
Yes. Take the Virupaksha temple at Hampi.
Okay.
This was a major Vijayanagara era site, and the maps from that period really show how important it was. It's not just shown as a building, it's often depicted as this grand dominating presence with the whole city of Hampi organized around it.
So if you were a pilgrim coming into Hampi, the map wouldn't just help you find your way around, it would tell you about how sacred the place was and the central role of the Virupaksha temple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is this temple-centric approach wasn't just for Hindu maps.
Oh.
You see it in Jain and Buddhist maps, too.
Huh.
They also put their sacred sites at the center. So this idea of a sacred geography, it went beyond just one religion.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. These maps were more like visual representations of faith than just like tools for getting from A to B.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing things didn't stay that way forever, right?
Right. The Mughals came in during the 16th century and brought new artistic and cultural influences to India. And we see this in their maps, too.
The Mughals? Huh? They were known for their love of grandeur and beauty, right?
Yeah.
Like, didn't Babur, the first Mughal emperor, have kind of an obsession with gardens?
He did.
Yeah.
He even meticulously documented all his favorite gardens in his memoirs.
Wow.
And this appreciation for aesthetics definitely shows up in Mughal maps. They were so much more than practical guides.
Mm-hmm.
They were often these beautiful pieces of art
Oh,
filled
wow.
with intricate details and symbolism.
So it's like they were trying to create an experience for the viewer to, like, immerse them in the splendor of the Mughal world.
Exactly.
Okay.
For example, they often included elements of Timurid art and architecture, which is a style that came from Central Asia. One of the most striking things was the Charbagh, or four-garden layout,
All right.
which showed Islamic beliefs about paradise. Imagine a map that's not just showing you where a garden is, but inviting you into a symbolic representation of heaven on earth.
Wow, that's a far cry from the, like, just purely functional maps we're used to today.
Right.
It seems like for the Mughals, the map itself was a way of expressing their power and legitimacy, almost like a visual declaration of their control over the land.
Absolutely. And this blend of aesthetics, cosmology, and power is what makes Mughal cartography so fascinating. It really challenges how we think about maps today, and how they work.
Okay, so we've got these temple-centric maps that emphasize how sacred certain sites are.
Yeah.
And then we have these Mughal maps that are like works of art filled with symbolism and power. But then, of course, came the British.
And with the British East India Company, we see another big change in how India was mapped.
Yeah.
Their approach was way more practical, focused on control, administration, and getting resources.
I guess that makes sense given their goals in India. But how did this change actually show up in the maps themselves?
Well, one thing was they moved away from the symbolic and religious parts of the earlier maps.
Okay.
The British were all about making what they thought were scientific and objective representations of the landscape.
So it was all about precision and measurement, like those huge survey projects they did, right?
Exactly like the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, which was this enormous project to map the whole subcontinent using all the latest technologies like theodolites and trigonometry.
Huh.
They even used hot air balloons to get views from the air.
Oh, wow.
It was a really ambitious project, all because they wanted to make India easy to understand and control for the British administration.
So it sounds like they were trying to force a new way of seeing and understanding India.
Yeah.
One that took away all the religious and cultural meaning that was so important in the earlier maps.
Yeah, you could say that. In many ways, their maps were tools of empire designed to help the British. But it's important to remember that even though they tried to impose their own vision, they weren't totally immune to the influence of those earlier ways of mapping.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
So you're saying there might be some hints of those older worldviews hidden beneath the surface of those seemingly objective British maps.
Yeah.
And that's what I call interesting. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's so interesting how these different mapping traditions bumped into each other and sometimes even blended together. The British, with all their focus on scientific cartography, they couldn't totally escape the influence of the cultures they were, interacting with.
So even as they were trying to make these objective, like practical maps, they were still absorbing things from the existing cultural landscape.
Exactly. Think about it. They often relied on local guides and interpreters who had their own understanding of the land, and that inevitably shaped the final map.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll see British maps that have place names or symbols that clearly come from those earlier traditions. It's like they were trying to impose a grid on a landscape that already had all these deep meanings and stories attached to it.
That makes me think about those temple-centric maps. Like, it's not just about putting a temple in the middle, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about how the whole map is structured to reflect that worldview.
Right, exactly. Think about how the other things around the temple are often shown, like rivers might be shown flowing from the temple, almost as if it's the source of everything. Life sustenance mountains might be arranged in a way that makes it look like they're bowing down to the temple, acknowledging its spiritual power.
So the map itself becomes a way of reinforcing those beliefs about how sacred the place is. It's like a visual sermon etched onto parchment.
Exactly. And this idea of the map as a storytelling tool, that's something we see in the mobile maps too, but in a different way.
Okay, how...
Well, remember we talked about how much the Mughals loved gardens, their maps of gardens? They weren't just about showing the layout, the paths, the flower beds.
Yeah.
They had all these amazing details, flowers and bloom fountains, spraying water pavilions where people could relax and enjoy the view.
It's like you can almost smell the roses and hear the birds singing just by looking at the map.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They were designed to give you a sensory experience to make you feel like you're in this perfect world.
Right.
It's almost as if they were creating a visual poem celebrating the beauty and harmony of the Mughal garden.
That's so different from how the British did things, which seems almost cold in comparison.
Yeah, it's a big contrast that the British, with all their focus on being accurate and measuring everything, they often took away those layers of meaning and symbolism. Their maps were about control, about turning the landscape into a bunch of data points that they could manage and use for their own purposes. But as you said earlier, even those British maps couldn't completely get rid of the influence of those earlier traditions.
Do you have any specific examples of that mixing of styles?
Yeah, definitely look at some of the early British maps of the Himalayas.
Right.
They were definitely using all the newest surveying techniques, but sometimes you'll see that they also included things from traditional Tibetan Buddhist art.
Okay.
Like mandalas or pictures of deities. It's like the map makers, maybe without even realizing it, were acknowledging the spiritual importance of these mountains, even as they were trying to map them in this purely scientific way.
That's so cool. It's like this little window into the cultural exchange that was happening even in the middle of this colonial project.
Yeah,
It makes you wonder what other hidden stories are tucked away in these maps just waiting to be discovered.
exactly. And that's why it's so important to look beyond just what's on the surface.
Yeah.
To think about the history and the culture surrounding these maps. When they were made, they weren't just tools for getting around. They reflected how people understood the world, their place in it, and their connection to the sacred.
And that brings us to a really important question. Whose maps are we talking about? Whose point of view is being shown?
That's such a key point. We have to remember that these maps, while fascinating, often show us the perspective of the elite, the people in power, the rulers.
Right.
They don't necessarily tell us much about what life was like for everyday people or what they believed.
So whose maps are we missing here? What about the tribal communities, the rural folks, the people whose lives were most affected by the land, but who might not have had the means or the chance to make their own maps?
That's something to really think about, their understanding of the land. Their sacred places might have been totally different from what we see in the maps made by the ruling classes.
Right.
And their stories are just as important, just as valuable if we want to put together a complete picture of India's past.
It's like we've been looking at this incredibly detailed tapestry, but only from one side. There's a whole other side with its own patterns and textures that we're just starting to get a glimpse of.
Exactly. And as we head into the last part of our deep dive, I want you to think about the maps that you use in your own life, not just physical maps, but those mental maps we all have in our heads.
You mean those internal maps that guide our decisions, our beliefs, our sense of where we belong in the world? How are those maps shaped by history, culture, and power? And whose perspectives might they be missing? It's really interesting to think about those mental maps like our own personal landscapes of meaning and belief. It makes you wonder if those mental maps are just as vulnerable to those biases and power dynamics that we saw in the physical maps.
I think that's a really smart point. Our mental maps are formed by our experiences, our education, the media. We consume all kinds of things that we might not even realize are influencing us.
So it's like we're always taking in information that's shaping our understanding of the world, but we don't always question where that information is coming from or what agendas might be behind it.
Exactly. And just like those British map makers were trying to push a certain view of India with their surveys, there are forces today trying to shape our mental maps often for their own gain.
Okay, so can you give me an example of how this happens in our everyday lives?
Well, think about the algorithms that control social media. They're designed to keep us hooked, to keep showing us stuff that fits with what we already believe and like. And while that might seem fine at first, it can create these echo chambers where we only see information that supports our worldview, even if that worldview is based on incomplete or biased information.
So these algorithms are kind of creating a personalized mental map for each of us, but it might be a map that's distorted or incomplete.
Exactly. And this can have real consequences. It can affect how we vote our relationships, even our sense of who we are and what we believe in. And it's like we're navigating the world with a map that's been secretly messed with without us knowing.
It's a little creepy when you think about it. It really makes you realize how important it is to be critical of the information we get, to question the maps that we're given, both literally and figuratively.
Absolutely. And just as those pre-modern Indian maps often put the sacred right in the center, we need to think about what we put at the center of our own mental maps. What are our core principles? What values matter most to us? And are those values really our own, or have they been shaped by outside forces that we haven't really thought about?
Those are some powerful questions.
Yeah.
It's like you're asking us to become the cartographers of our own minds, to choose what we want our mental landscapes to be like.
In a way, yes, because just like those ancient map makers had the power to shape how people saw their world, we have the power to shape our own understanding of the world, and that's a responsibility we should take seriously.
This has been an amazing journey exploring not just the maps of India's past, but the maps we carry within ourselves. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will leave with today?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that maps are never neutral. They're always a product of their time and place, reflecting the perspectives and goals of the people who made them. And whether we're looking at a pre-modern map of a sacred place or a digital map on our phone, we need to be aware of those biases and be willing to question them.
So to our listeners, as you navigate the world, both physically and mentally, remember to be mindful of the maps you're using. Don't be afraid to question their assumptions, to look for different viewpoints, and to draw your own conclusions.
Because in a world overflowing with information, the ability to think critically about the maps we use, both literal and metaphorical, is more important than ever.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of cartography. It's been a thought-provoking look at how maps shape our understanding of the world, both past and present. Until next time, keep exploring.